So, in particular, we wanted to talk about what it's like being trans in our federal prison systems right now. And I suppose even beyond that, at the state and local level. So, just broadly speaking, can you tell us a little bit about what happens when someone who is trans or is gender nonconforming is sentenced to a prison? I mean, who decides where they go and why?
Sure. The first interaction with the prison complex is generally going to be a county jail.
Hmm.
And so that's going to be whenever you're arrested, you're of course going to go through a search procedure. So that's going to reveal aspects about your physical characteristics that is going to in part determine where you are placed. There's something called the Prison Rape Elimination Act that was passed in 2003 that says you cannot place a person in a facility that's designated either for male or female solely on their genital configuration. But our experience is that most county jails do exactly that, even though
Hmm.
they claim they don't. So that's probably for most people, that's search is going to be the first thing that assigns them to one side or the other in a jail facility. Technically, there should be then an intake that happens in the next few days, and this is for whether you're in a jail or you're going into the prison system after you've been convicted of criminalized behavior. And there would be an intake that is supposed to consider multiple factors on what are your characteristics of vulnerabilities to sexual abuse and other violence, as well as what would be safest for you in the setting that you're going into. Um, Technically, that should mean that you could go to either of those two binary options for male or female. But again, as we have seen over and over in almost every prison system, it's based on physical genital configurations. So that's really um, I think you would say that's the determinant for how you're going to be placed, even though there are supposed to be policies in place at the local, state, and federal level that give broader latitude in how you assign a person to male or female facilities. It really turns out it's genital configuration almost everywhere.
Yeah, so that latitude is really just permission to do whatever you want and to buy into these outdated notions of gender. Is that at all
It's
fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. We find that a lot of times people say, "We don't discriminate. We have policy that says we don't." And they depend on that policy to excuse their abuses of people. And so,
Hmm.
sure, that latitude is just on paper. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right now, our, very binary two-party political system is deeply entrenched in conversations about gender. And with the election cycles bouncing back and forth and everything being so politicized, how have the, national narratives around prison placement changed over the past couple of past decade or so?
We've seen some advances in the earlier 2000s. So you had some things like Michelle Kosilek in Massachusetts, who she initially won um, some rights within the prisons for gender affirming healthcare. And that's what a lot of the focus has been in the prison system, is whether somebody should be able to have access to gender affirming healthcare. And so you've had that began in the early 2000s and going up through Michelle Leal Norsworthy in California and Shiloh Quinn in California, who won suits for gender affirming care. You've also had some things like in California, they've recently passed bills that reinforce the ability for trans persons to be assigned according to their gender identity, not according to just physical characteristics. So that's reinforced those rights just in some certain places, like California has it. I believe New Jersey has passed a new law that benefits that to some extent. So these are a couple of things that the conversation has been around prior to our previous administration. When the Trump administration came in, they rolled back some of those things because that was a much more hardline anti-trans, anti-queer group.
Sure.
And one means that they used to do that was what's called the transgender policy at the federal prison level, which initially was published or for the first time promulgated under Obama. And then Trump took that and rolled it back to where basically they said that the primary consideration for placement in a male or female unit would be genital configuration. So the policy actually was a violation of the PREA standards because it said you have to use that as your determination for whether to place somebody in a male or female facility. That was recently in 2021 moved forward by the Biden administration to where now they made a much more affirming, took a much more affirming stance where they said, no, you have to consider the entire status of where a person is and what their vulnerabilities are. You cannot, according to PREA and according to the DOJ and the Bureau of Prisons now, you cannot assign a person solely based on genital status to a male or female facility. So that just happened last year. That's kind of how those are the two main topics, I think, that have kind of bounced around back and forth between the cycle through the administrations at the federal level. At the state level and county level, I think those conversations have probably been a little bit less relevant. The federal level is where these tend to happen with a little bit more influence.
Because like governorships don't turn over from party as often as the national level does, or is there a different factor here?
I'm not really sure, but the feds seem to take accountability to federal law and federal regulations a little more seriously than the states do. And I think it probably has to do with feelings of states' rights. And so they're not as accountable to certain federal laws that they don't want to follow, such as the Prison Rape Elimination Act. States don't have to follow it. Although most states have, there's still 3 or 4 that still refuse to follow PREA guidelines. So I think it's partly that, and I think it's partly just states don't want to be told what to do by the federal system, and they want to spend their money and negotiate their power structures or manage their power structures, such as the prison system, in the way they want to. And so also prisons just have a real history of local rule, whether that's one system or the units not wanting to follow what headquarters say. The local rule is very much a thing in prison systems, that each prison is expected to kind of have leeway to do what they want to do.
Something of a fiefdom.
A fiefdom, yeah.
Sure.
It's very much true. And that extends back through the history of prisons in the United States. So.
Well, I know that this isn't the only part of government that has a tendency to waffle back and forth as the cycles change, but what kind of impact does it have to be getting such like mixed messages from the top every 4 or 8 years?
I think it's dehumanizing because it objectifies persons. So especially for trans persons, if they're getting different messages coming down, they're just an object in political play. And that's going to be dehumanizing. The whole prison system is dehumanizing, from just being in a warehouse full of people to the violence that's inside of prisons because of the economy and how the economy works inside prisons, to just the routine denial of little things like phone calls and showers and recreation. All of that's dehumanizing. And so this just adds a layer to that, where you're just a political ping pong ball that's bounced back and forth for political gain. One thing that we sometimes hear from people is that nobody hears me as a person. And so this is just another way that people in prison are objectified.
Yeah. Well, I just heard you say how much it varies place to place, but can you speak at all about any particular accommodations or special protections that trans inmates might have access to?
Sure. The main thing that gives some rights to trans persons in prison is, again, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or what we call PREA.
Mhm.
And PREA does a few things not well. So
Sure.
PREA says that, as we've already discussed a little bit, that you are not supposed to assign a person to a facility based solely on their genital status. So that is something that PREA tries to do, but it doesn't do much. For example, in TDCJ, we now know that there are somewhere around 1,100 to 1,200 persons identified as transgender. And we've only heard the entire time we've been doing this work of one trans person that's on a gender affirming unit.
Hmm.
And it was because she had bottom surgery. So that pretty much is the exception that means they're
That
not
proves the
following it.
rule.
That
Yeah.
proves it, yeah. So there's that's provided by PREA. There's a little bit more of a guidance, I guess, and that PREA says that trans persons should be able to shower separately, and that's because the showers can be a place where people are exposed to violence. And
Mhm.
so we've all seen old prison movies where they have the big gang showers. Those went out quite a while ago, but they are still common in older prisons. And Texas has prisons that were built in the late 1800s and 1900s that only have those big gang showers. So those you can't meet PREA compliance by offering the opportunity to shower separate. So PREA pretty much says that trans persons can't be housed on those types of units unless you make some sort of special accommodations. So trans persons tend to be housed on units that are newer, that have individual showers, or at least what they call 5-bay showers that have partitions between them.
Mhm.
Um, Another thing is that searches should be done respectfully and with the least intrusion possible to the circumstances. That's pretty vague.
Sure.
So, a lot can fall under that, but that's something that's in there that supposedly they're supposed to follow. And that in PREA guidelines that kind of goes into a little bit more specifics about how somebody can search under the breast area or along the groin area, but it's guidelines and it's not part of compliance. So they have an option of not doing that. Um, those are that's about it as far as the main consideration.
Any
Now
special protections?
yeah. Um, you have different various things like California does have some things. New York has some things where you can be housed separately. You have separate considerations for a trans person being considered more vulnerable, so you can get into special housing more easily. In Texas, we have something called safekeeping. Um, and that is a housing designation for people who are more vulnerable to sexual abuse and sexual uh, misconduct. But that comes with some negatives as well. There's a different kind of drama in safekeeping, and some of the guards use it for punishment.
Mhm.
So instead of being safer, sometimes the guards will encourage people to snitch on other people, even if they didn't do anything. And so there's that drama that's in there that sometimes the guards create, sometimes people in the prisons create. There's also, because safekeeping tends to be mostly trans and queer persons, sometimes safekeeping housing gets routinely worse treatment.
Mhm.
So they may always go to commissary last. So most of the items are gone from commissary. They may go to meals last. So they're shorted food or get cold food or the last and smallest proportions. They may not go to recreation, things like that. So safekeeping can have some benefits, but it can also have some negatives.
Theoretically an accommodation, but in reality, perhaps not so much. I imagine the list of like structural challenges is a lot longer than particular protections. But from a like institutional level, can you walk us through some of the challenges that trans folks face here?
Sure. By institutional, I'm going to take it that you mean kind of the prison structures and
Yeah, from like a standpoint of the organization itself, because I know we'll want to talk as well about what it's like being trans in a prison and having to interact with the other people there and just the day-to-day type of stress.
okay. Um, I think structurally, of course, it's one thing is that it's divided into a gender binary, and not
Hmm.
everybody is going to fit that binary, and not
Right.
everybody is going to fit um, the characteristics that are stereotypically associated with the binary. That's
Mm-hmm.
going to cause problems with persons and how they interact trying to be force fit into a binary that doesn't fit them. It also there's I think you could consider the prison economy as part of the structure. And so for trans persons going into a prison, they're entering a system that has its own economy. And a lot of the non-trans persons in the prison system will consider that a person is trans only for sex, and because sex is a means of engaging in the prison economy.
Mm-hmm.
And so a trans person is pretty much immediately taken as a sex object in the prison system. Um, and when when that happens, then they become an object of extortion. They become an object of harassment. They become expected to perform certain activities, whether it's washing clothes or cleaning a cell for people. They're also, because of the organizational structure, meaning what people call gangs. I don't really like that word, so I usually say prison organizations or prison associations.
Mm-hmm.
But because of that structure and how powerful those are in some of the prisons, um, then you can be expected to pay for protection, and that can involve different things from commissary to providing sexual favors. One reason that trans person are particularly vulnerable to that is because no trans person can be a part of a prison association. So you're always doing what's called riding solo. So trans persons are, especially ones that are pretty out in the prison system, are known to be solo. So that just makes them a target for extortion because they have no family to back them up and to stand for them if they get into trouble. They're always solo. Now, some trans persons do associate or affiliate with prison organizations, but it's partly they're paying for protection. And so that's engaging in that economy, but you're always on a negotiation footing, I guess, in that, where your safety is constantly at risk. Another structural thing would be just the way the prison system works in terms of the guards not really providing protection, and the kind of status quo of what some people call fight or fuck. And so we've had lots of people report to us that the guards will just say, well, you have to fight or fuck. And that's just so much a part of the prison. And for trans persons also, and really for anybody, but this especially affects trans persons, if you fight, you get a disciplinary case and you're put in solitary. If you have sex with somebody, it typically gets worse over time because you've shown that you can be exploited for sex. And so neither one of those are a good situation.
Sure.
What often happens when, due to the grievance system and how that works, if you file a grievance for something, then you again become a target in different ways. So you can become a target from the staff, because oftentimes the staff see trans persons as lower on the prison hierarchy, and so they will negotiate with trans persons. Well, you turn in who's running contraband over here, then we'll get you, some protection. And so then the trans person gets into more trouble because they're snitching on somebody, but they have this hard choice. They're being denied protection for if they don't snitch, but they're being put in more danger if they do. And all of those are part of just kind of structures of the way the prison system works. Did you have something specific you were looking for in terms of structures on that?
No, I suppose in my mind there is something of a distinction between the guards, the institution, the rules and regulations of the place, and then just the day-to-day experience of being in that culture and of being living through those kind of day-to-day trials. So
You,
yeah,
uh,
I feel like you covered really well what that looks like from a kind of zoomed out view, but it I just have to say generally sounds exhausting.
Yeah, prison is exhausting, not only from the types of things you have to put up with day to day, but even literally because you don't get sleep. The guards come by and wake you up, and almost nobody gets a solid even 6 hours sleep.
Yeah, no doubt. Are there any individual stories that you might be able to share with us to help us understand what it's like being trans in the prison system?
Yeah, there's a choice. um, One, I think that I always think about in terms of kind of the abuses that some trans persons endure. This person is no longer subject to this, thankfully.
Hmm.
But this is a trans man. When he first got into TDCJ, he's assigned to a women's unit. He has had top surgery. He has changed all of his documentation. His driver's license said male. He did this 20 plus years ago. He was an early person who really got some things like documentation done before it was as common as it is today.
Hmm.
Um, when he was first assigned to prison, they forced him to wear a bra, even though he'd had top surgery. They forced him to wear a nightgown. They denied him hormones. Um, they used to take during group strip searches, they would take his clothes when he would strip, they would take his clothes and throw them across the room and make him run across in front of everybody to get his clothes and get them back. Thankfully, he no longer has those issues. It's improved since then.
Hmm.
So that's one type of example. Another one is somebody that we were working with not too long ago, last year. She was assigned to a unit, and previously in her history, what a lot of people will do when they go into prison is they will become affiliated with a gang
Hmm.
or a prison association. And she did that when she first got in. It's a safety issue and kind
Sure.
of a belonging issue. And she was associated with one. I won't mention which one it was, but it can be pretty oppressive.
Hmm.
And then she came out as trans. And once she came out as trans, she is banned from that group. And in
Hmm.
fact, they can actually cause violence. If some units, they'll say, no, you can't walk on this unit. So you have to do something to get off the unit. Well, she's had trouble at many different units since she came out, partly because she has tattoos on her face that are affiliated with this group.
Mm.
And so that is something that you do to prove your loyalty to a group. But once you get out, it does nothing but cause problems.
You're branded in
So,
that way. Sure.
yeah, so she was on a unit where it just has a terrible reputation for abusing trans persons in particular. And she started telling us that she was having problems there due to this group saying she could not stay on this unit. And we were able to get her pulled out by writing letters and get her pulled out and put in different housing. So they pulled her out and put her in solitary and did an investigation, then rehoused her. They housed her with as a cellmate with one of the speakers for that very group. And so then she was being sexually abused by this guy. And we were like, no, this doesn't happen. This couldn't happen. But she had given us his name. and we have a way of looking up to see what cell somebody is in. And we were able to confirm that these two people were in the same cell, and even look up news reports to verify that this guy is associated with the group. And so we wrote more letters, and they refused to do anything. We wound up in this case getting a Texas senator involved, and even he called the unit and said, "You need to get this person away from this unit," and the unit still refused. And eventually the unit did get her to did transfer or approve or recommend her for transfer and send her to a different unit. But we can't figure out why certain things like that happen. But
Why
that
that was
is,
ever allowed in the first place. Sure.
yeah, but that can be somebody's experience as well. Gosh, there's another one. Do you want me to give another one?
I mean, it definitely sounds dark. I suppose I'd be interested to know if you feel as if these stories are becoming more or less common as trans issues become more and more embattled in our culture war.
I think they're shifting.
Mm,
So, when we first started writing to persons in the Texas prisons, there were only about 3 dozen out trans persons in the prison. And I think there's just various reasons that this number would have grown, but now there's almost somewhere between 1,100 and 1,200 that are out. And that's probably partly because we're the first organization that was kind of openly supporting trans person and engaging with advocacy for the Texas prison systems for trans persons.
mhm.
And we're fairly well known throughout the prison system. That's meant that some people in the prison system have started creating backlash against us. One
Sure.
prison guard apparently tried to accuse us of running contraband. That person was eventually removed from the prison system, from TDCJ.
Mhm.
But as the number of persons have increased, and as the trans persons in the Texas prison system have become more invisible, there's been a shift in how they're treated, and the mistreatment is a little less obvious,
Mm,
not
sure.
less harmful
Right.
necessarily. And so some of the really obvious things, like somebody, a counselor at one point, when somebody came out as trans and was asking to get started on hormones, the counselor told this person, "You're letting what did he say? The father of lies talk to you. There is no such thing as trans," or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And so the person reported it to us. We were able to get a little attention to it. That person it was suggested that they retire. So some things like that are changing, but then the abuses have become more subtle, but not necessarily less.
Our theocracy is just going a little bit underground in some places.
Right. And so we've seen it where currently they're even starting to use appropriate pronouns and names in the Texas system. That's just started last year and this year. But at the same time, you've got certain guards and certain administrators in various units that are
Sure.
very anti-trans, that
I mean,
will.
the demographic overlap, I definitely feel is particularly going to be in conflict with trans folks and trans
Right,
rights.
right. So we really thought it would get a lot worse during COVID,
Mm,
that there would be a lot of problems there. Um, but so I think there's not really an exactly obvious way where you can point to, yes, this is getting a lot worse because of the exposure in the public sphere with discussions of trans issues. But the best way I have of describing it is it's shifting, so that it's a little
mm.
bit more subtle but worse, and sometimes it impacts people more broadly.
Sure.